So I'm going to talk about some of the history of 1888 and following in regard to liberty of conscience, but I want to set the stage just a little bit. We haven't really talked yet today, I believe, about an organization. 1863, as we all know, was the date when Seventh-day Adventists organized. Now, obviously, they'd been Adventists since the Millerite movement, and here Baptists and Methodists and Christian Connection people got together after study and the Lord's blessing and formed the Seventh-day Adventist Church. What we often forget or may not know about is that very year the NRA formed. And I'm not talking about the National Rifle Association. I'm talking about the National Reform Association. And there's something we need to understand. I won't have time to go into it in detail at all today, but we need to understand why the National Reform Association formed. And I was very thankful for Ron Knott's introductory and his talk, and for other comments that have been made about how we look at evangelicals who are, I believe, rising up against legitimate concerns. And this is why the National Reform Association formed the same year the Seventh-day Adventists organized. Notice, this is out of Eric Syme's book. The secularizing of America in the 1860s disturbed Protestant Americans who feared that liberals were de-Christianizing the country, and to organize support, they formed the National Reform Association on February 4, 1863. There was a moral decline in this country following the Great Disappointment. And you will read about that not only in our own church history books, but you'll read about it, I've just found recently, even in the secular press. There was spiritualism, evolution started rising in this country. And I found in Uriah Smith's book, Marvel of Nation, socialism and communism also started to raise their head in this country during this time. And in response, the National Reform Association formed. So they were fighting or concerned about legitimate issues. It's just immediately they decided that the way to solve it was to go to the Caesar to enforce Christianity upon the nation. They lost the power of the gospel that changes people's hearts. So again, legitimate concern. Now, I don't have time to go into this, but Uriah Smith spends 20 pages showing how this liberal, conservative issue pendulum swung for 40 years and came to a peak. He doesn't cover this part, but came to a pinnacle in 1888. After 1863, they immediately wanted to bring a change to the Constitution, and they were pushing for Sunday laws. And in response, liberalism immediately erupted. And then in response to that, conservative national reform rose to the occasion, and the pendulum swung back and forth. Well, in 1879, after 16 years of attempting federal legislation, the NRA decided to go state by state, and it was immediately effective. State by state they went, and there wasn't a state in the Union or a territory that either didn't reenact Sunday laws that were already on the books or legislate new laws that within just a short time covered this country and all the states and territories at that time. 1,600 people were arrested in California alone in 1882, including W.C. White and J.H. Wagner, over Sunday law issues. Just 30 miles from my home, somebody was fined $25 at an Adventist camp meeting for having a kitchen open in violation of Sunday laws. But so in 1879, as they went state by state, it became very a positive effect for their movement. In 1888, only 9 years later, it wasn't just a national reform. There was 3 other organizations that joined. And this was a powerful, what had started out as a grassroots movement that had covered the entire country, where these groups were joined together to bring about a change in our country, to Christianize it. Again, they had legitimate reasons, but it's the way they were going about it. And we've already talked about the Blair Bill on May 21. It was a national Sunday law. Notice why they wanted to do it. It was a national Sunday law is needed to make the state laws complete and effective. That's all they were doing. But there was another bill on the 25th, 4 days later. Blair wanted to introduce this bill, and that was an amendment to the Constitution. And the idea in this was to establish the Christian religion as a religion of the nation, and this to the exclusion of all other religions. Do you see how quickly what the founders of this country had instituted would have changed if this had gone through? And all of this set the context then, or the background to what Ellen White would title or call the most important meeting. Think about this. A general conference when all the leadership of this church would gather to then go out to the membership and share what God was intending to do at this conference. And Ellen White, based on some dreams she had that summer, had this to say when she wrote to the brethren in the summer of 1888. She said, "We are impressed that this gathering will be the most important meeting you have ever attended. All selfish ambition should be laid aside, and you should plead with God for His Spirit to descend upon you as it came upon the disciples who were assembled together on the day of Pentecost." That is latter rain language. And I believe with all my heart that God not only intended, but He began to pour out the Holy Spirit in Minneapolis and following because He wanted to prepare this people for what was coming on the earth. Well, what about the presentation at Minneapolis? Now, I have, like I said, spent probably 25 years writing and speaking more recently on the topic of righteousness by faith or justification in a history setting, not so much theologically, but just talking about how this was a message that came. But it's only recently that I realized that liberty of conscience was at the very foundation of that meeting that took place. Now, I realize I'm late to the game. Maybe all of you already understood this, but I will show you a few slides here of why I finally come to this conclusion recently as I've been reading books on liberty of conscience. This is W.C. Wright writing about 2 years after the conference to Dan Jones, the General Conference Secretary, and he's telling him, you know, the plans for the Minneapolis Conference. And he says, early in 1888, I began corresponding with Elder Butler, General Conference President, about the institute to precede the Minneapolis Conference. I proposed 4 or 5 lines of work, among which were the duties of church officers, new advanced measures for carrying the message, the study of Bible doctrines, and then notice, included in that list, our religious liberty work, and 1 or 2 other lines I can't recall. So even here is evidence that the plan was, even before the conference, that liberty of conscience would be a subject talked about at Minneapolis.